Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Karin Roffman and I'm moderating the panel today, and I am so happy to be talking with Heather Clark and DT Max and Ruth Franklin about their books and about writing about writers in general. Let me just briefly, they need no introduction, but let me just briefly give you one. Heather Clark has recently published Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath. And she received an NIH Public Scholar Fellowship in 2017, 2018, and also was a Leon Levy Center for Biography Fellow. Ruth Franklin is a book critic and former editor of the New Republic, and her biography, Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography, and as well as the Bio Plutarch Award, as well as it was a New York Times notable book of 2016. DT Max is a staff writer at The New Yorker, and his book, Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, A Life of David Foster Wallace, was a New York Times bestseller. He's also the author of The Family That Couldn't Sleep, a medical mystery, and writes regularly for The New Yorker. You probably saw his recent and totally fascinating essay on a mysterious suicide cluster, which was last month. So thank you all for being here and for talking about this subject that I love to talk about, and that has its such specific needs and such a specific conversation has developed around it. And I thought maybe one way to open the conversation up and just start is to talk about how you chose your subjects. And Heather, I thought since you're the newest, your book is the newest, we should start with you. Oh, you're.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I had written an academic book about Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, and that took me about 5 years to write. And it was about their mutual creative partnership. I was just really fascinated by the fact that two of what I consider the greatest poets of the post-war period were married. And what did they learn from each other? And so I wrote that book, and the idea of writing a full-length Plath biography just began to take shape because I knew there was a lot of new material coming down the road. I knew that her collected letters were going to be published in 2018, and I was actually sort of a part of that. And I knew that the Plath estate had changed hands, and that was a big deal. Things were just a little bit easier in terms of permissions, and also there was a new archive of Plath material that surfaced in sort of 2019, but I didn't know that earlier on, but that was serendipitous. So I felt like earlier biographies had taken a more sensationalistic approach to her life. And I just sort of felt like it was, I don't know, that it was time for kind of a more literary, critical biography of Plath. So I took the plunge.
Bruce, do you want to continue?
Sure. Thank you, Karin, for that introduction. I'll just say briefly, apologies for my ridiculous looking attire. I have an eye infection that I don't want you all to see. So Shirley Jackson, I had been working as a book critic for a little while, and felt a little bit frustrated with the limits of book criticism, in that I wanted to delve more deeply into the writer's life, and it just felt like there was no opportunity for that when I was simply writing book reviews. I've just really always been interested in the creative process and what leads a particular person to create the work they do at that particular moment in history. Just what are all the forces that come together and make that possible? And Shirley Jackson was just one of these writers who I always had in the back of my mind as a kind of a touchstone, somebody who was important to me for reasons I had never even really thought about defining, but who had always kind of been there in the background for me as somebody I'd always been thinking about. And I started looking around, and there was one biography of Jackson that had come out a couple decades earlier. And it didn't, it, you know, had told a lot of stories about her life, but didn't really go into the aspects that I wanted most to know about. That is her creative process, and, you know, just the real nuts and bolts, the details of what she was thinking about when she was writing her mysterious books. And at around the same time, the Library of America brought out a new anthology of Jackson's writing. And it was there for the first time that I encountered her memoiristic writing about her life as a mother. And like many critics, you know, of her time and since then, I was initially really startled by the idea that somebody like that Jackson could have written, you know, the fiction, the suspenseful and dark fiction that she's so well known for, and also these, you know, very light, cheerful, and, you know, in some ways cheerful stories about her family life. And there's one in particular, which she calls The Third Baby's the Easiest, where she writes about checking into the hospital to give birth to her third child. And the clerk asks her to state her profession. And she says, writer. And this would actually have been shortly after The Lottery was published in the New Yorker and became a huge sensation, making her, you know, not just a writer, but a rather famous writer. So she said, writer. And the clerk said to her, I'll just put down housewife. And reading that anecdote in this story, kind of for me, just sort of, that was the moment when I knew I wanted to write the biography of Shirley Jackson, because I felt like that one moment encapsulated so much of what it must have been like to be her, or to be a woman like her, a creative woman living in, you know, America in the late 1940s, 1950s, this era of total glorification of the housewife. And just, I felt like that, just that little moment of her life, it gave me an angle into how unbelievably hard it must have been to be somebody like her. And that was kind of my point into it.
Daniel.
First of all, thanks for including me. I feel like my biography is the longest to go. And if you hear some chirping in the background, it's the family Finches, because there's no easy room to do things during COVID. But so with Wallace, you know, I can remember everyone always wanted a kind of creation myth story of my interest in David, but it came about through very, very ordinary means, which is I was a writer at the New Yorker, and I was as ever looking for an assignment, and then David died by suicide. I had been a reader, and I don't think, you know, the absolute best reader he had incredible readers. I remember I started on the assignment, and the more I read him and the more carefully I read him, the more deeply I grew interested in him. And then after the piece came out, you know, there was kind of a deep interest in David right after his death. And I felt two things after the New Yorker piece came out. It was a very, very long piece. One was I felt that I had not had time to read him as much as I wanted to, because I mean, you know, there's a lot to read. And even with a long journalistic deadline, I felt like I had really not sunk myself as deeply into, especially the secondary works, as I would have liked. And I needed an excuse somehow to do that. So I thought, I'll write a biography. And then two, you know, I come essentially from a journalistic background. And this David's story was simply a remarkable story. I mean, there was a fellow who was very important to the history of this organization, Jim Atlas. And Jim always used to say, Dan, go write a biography. And I was like, I don't know, Jim. I can't, go write a biography. And then it ever occurred to me that there was somebody I wanted to write about, which, you know, it's sort of like, go get married. Well, who you get married? So, you know, it was kind of like, I thought, oh, this is the person I meant to write a biography about. And so that's how I got started on mine.
So, I mean, all of you have really delved deeply. It's a word that all of you used just now in your interest. And you've really done so much work on you know, reimagining these writers from your incredible research. And I think all of you, your research included interviews. right? And Heather, you found that amazing trove of older interviews that you drew from as well in your biography. And I was just wondering, given that unbelievable amount of information, and there was just a panel just now about research, how did you decide how to allocate what you were learning to the life and to the work and to the relations between those things? I mean, this is a particular, I think, one needs a particular strategy, I think, in writing about writers, perhaps maybe even more than writing about other kinds of professionals.
Should I go first?
Well, you can just jump in. I mean, okay. Yeah, just jump in. We can just have a conversation.
Okay. Yeah, this actually came up in the literary biography roundtable that I just attended with Ruth, and it's something that I thought about every single day as I was writing, the relationship between the work and the life, and how much space to give each one. And because I'm a literary critic, I'm an academic. I'm an English professor, and so I really, I was very cognizant of my desire to kind of go into these literary critical weeds, and I really had to stop myself. And but I was aware of it always, and I did not want to go down that road. And I had to constantly remind myself, I'm writing a biography. There's a ton of literary criticism on Sylvia Plath out there. Fantastic literary criticism. I am writing about the life, and I want to contextualize the work within the life. But that is my mission. And I wanted, the question that guided me through the whole biography was, how did Sylvia Plath become the writer that she became? And so there was always the literary angle. And the story that I think she tells about herself in her letters and her journals is the story of a woman trying to become a great writer. It's not necessarily a story about mental illness and depression and suicide. It's a story of ambition and achievement and triumph. And I felt like that had kind of gotten lost in a lot of the biography. So it was always that literary trajectory, that literary story I was trying to tell, but I definitely had to sort of take a step back. Having said that, my editor encouraged me to discuss the poetry. And I did, but I tried to discuss it in a way that would interest the lay reader. I stayed very far away from any kind of jargon and that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, why do we care about Sylvia Plath? Because she wrote great poetry and fiction. So I did attend to the work, but I didn't, go on for 10 pages. But of course, yeah, I definitely wanted to do critical readings of it, especially her more important poems. Yeah. But it's a great question, and one that I think we all deal with all the time.
And that we probably all wish had an actual answer, right? Instead of just our stabbing in the dark trying to figure out how to do it. Yeah, I said also in our conversation, our roundtable, and I'll say again that I think every biography you needs to be figured out for itself from the beginning. That no two books are the same or even very similar, and part of the process is learning how to write your own book. And you're going to be better at that by the end of your book than you were at the beginning of your book, hopefully. But yeah, I think figuring out what to use of all the stuff you gather, and more importantly, even where to put it all, is the biographer's major challenge. And I wish I had sort of a simple explanation for how to do it, other than I think you kind of need to have the basic structure of your book. I would say pretty early on. I decided that it was going to be mainly chronological, because that's just the way they made most sense to me to tell the story of Shirley Jackson's life. I have a new subject, actually, Anne Frank, for whom I think that approach doesn't necessarily make sense, but I'm trying to figure out what approach does, but that's a whole other tangent. But I think, once you have the structure, one thing that happened for me, and this, sounds kind of woo out there, but after I was really, really deep in the research, and I mean like 3 or 4 years into the research, you start just having an intuitive sense of what's important and where things are going to go. And it's like the book is almost its own organism that sort of takes over and guides you along in a strange way. I'm curious, Daniel or Heather, if either of you had that kind of experience. But just for me, it was sort of like the deeper I got into it, the more evident everything felt to me in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ruth. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it quite the way she put it, but at the beginning, when you start a biography, everything seems possible, and then certainly everything seems useful, and you can imagine doing almost a critical book which barely mentions the life, and you can imagine doing a very life-focused book that barely mentions the work. And I think as you get going, there's a very complicated, I think, 3-part kind of drama between the life, the work, and you, right? Because you're a big piece of what's tolerable. So, for instance, Heather and I have somewhat different backgrounds. Again, I come from a particular world where space is extraordinarily valuable in a magazine as opposed to a book, and where things are winnowed and winnowed and winnowed until they're, with some loss sometimes, I think, of texture, until they're like razor sharp. And so I had to kind of fight within myself to give Wallace's work more space than I might have given it. It was easy enough to give Wallace's life this space. But often I found that when I tried to write about the work just almost as a separate window, literally a window on my computer, that I would feel like, and this was early, and then by the end, even though on some level it's impossible to sort of capture infinite jest, what's it, I think 1,066 page book in my biography is probably about 230 pages, with endnotes, right? So, I mean, there's a clear imbalance there. But I felt like I had done, that I had kind of given you what I had that would match what I was giving you in other areas. In other words, I wasn't really promising you a complete, like, critical biography, or essentially a critical analysis of Wallace. And I trusted that I had to think about it in balance with the life. And so, you had a very fast-paced life, especially early on. It would have seemed extremely strange to me as a reader, and I don't know that anyone else yet has covered this, but we're telling stories as biographers. Some of us more than others, but I think biography ranges in a way from like an almost mythic story to an almost file drawer of information, right? And we all find somewhere in that large continuum, like where we're going to come out. Because biography also has the job simply of bringing to light information that would otherwise be forgotten. I mean, only a handful of people are given biographies. And I know, for instance, working on Wallace, I knew that much material would disappear soon enough, partially because people die, also because just letters get lost. And so you're also battling there, I guess, a third thing, which is like, how much of what you learn do you put in? Like how many letters do you put in? How many excerpts from books do you put in? How many obscure reviews do you put in? I think that's all a very hard decision, but I do agree with Ruth that by the end, it's feeling pretty instinctive.
And there's a question from the audience that I'm going to pop in now because it fits, but I'll also say to the audience that please feel free to put questions into the chat and we'll take them in the last 15 minutes or so. But this question is asking if you imagined that your audience already knew the writer before you started. And this is a particularly interesting question to me because I think that in my own biography of John Ashbery, there was like this real split between people who knew him really, really well, who were poets already, and people who have never ever heard of him, which is like the vast majority of people. And to write between those two sets of ears is very, very different. And so but even in your biographies of people who are known much better, much more than he is, there's I think people who are great readers, and then people who really don't know and need an introduction. And I thought in all of your books, the preface served as an incredible, humane introduction to the reader. And so my question is twofold. One is, how do you think about this question that was asked in the chat? And second of all, it seemed like in your prefaces you were really imagining a kind of, or bringing a reader into your work that might not have known about it, or known about it in the way that you wanted them to sort of proceed with the reading of the rest of it. And so was the preface the last thing that you wrote? Was it something that you were writing all along? How did you reach that sense of kind of a few pages that really reaches the general reader, which I thought all of you did so marvelously?
That's a really interesting question. Oh, sorry, Heather, do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead.
Really, it's a question that I don't think I ever really posed to myself in those words of whether I was writing for somebody who knew Jackson's work or totally unfamiliar. I think in some way, I must have assumed that I was writing for a reader who at least had heard of Shirley Jackson, or, the story of the lottery, because it was so famous. I think if I was picturing the typical reader, I would have assumed somebody who knew the lottery but probably didn't know anything else about Shirley Jackson. And the goal of my book was to open up her work and reposition it for that reader. And that really was my goal from the very beginning. And the introduction to my book, parts of it came, basically verbatim from my book proposal. And so that was my vision for my book from the start. And it didn't change throughout the rest of the process. And I think based on my feedback from readers, I don't know of anybody who came to Shirley Jackson via my book having never heard of her before, although I suppose that it's possible. It seems much more likely that people will, come upon The Lottery or The Haunting of Hill House or some other book by Jackson that, draws them in, and then someone will tell them, oh, there's this biography out there that you might be interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I assume that everyone who would pick up my biography had heard of Sylvia Plath, but I was trying to kind of redefine her, I guess. And I believe my biography to date, it was the 11th biography of Sylvia Plath. So that was something that I struggled with, always, because people would always ask me, why do we need another biography of Sylvia Plath? Always. I mean, that was kind of the question, the most frequent question that I was at. So I was always trying to justify it to kind of other people, but also myself. And like Ruth, parts of my preface were from my book proposal as well. And I did kind of keep that vision, that initial vision of kind of trying to redefine her as a writer. As simplistic as that sounds, but that had sort of almost gotten lost in the kind of mythos of Plath. And I wanted to, and I've said this before, but Hermione Lee's Virginia Woolf biography was just such a huge inspiration for me. And she had a quote that was maybe the moment that when I read this quote, that was when I decided, okay, I need to write this biography. And this quote kind of undergirds my preface. And the quote is that women who have suffered from mental illness, self-harm, died by suicide are often treated as psychological case histories first, or victims first, and professional writers second. So my project was to kind of treat Plath as the professional writer first, and that I wanted to make that clear in my prologue. So that was kind of the main mission, and I assumed that everyone had had heard of Plath. But again, like Ruth, I was just sort of trying to reposition her in that sense, and also provide a lot more historical context to give people a sense of what she was up against, you know, trying to be a great writer as a woman and as a mother in the late 1950s and early 60s. So historical context was also really important to me.
Yeah, I actually, maybe because I once worked in publishing, had a kind of two-pronged approach to this. The hardcover of my book actually has no introduction. And it starts with the sentence, every story has a beginning, and this is David Wallace's, something like that. And then the last sentence of the book is something like, it wasn't the ending anyone would have, it wasn't the ending anyone would have wanted for David Wallace, but it was the ending he had chosen. So, I mean, there, obviously, one thing I was doing was emphasizing story, but also, and then then I figured by the time the paperback rolled around that memories were 1 year older. And also paperbacks, they hang around for a while in a way that hardcovers don't. I mean, you know, they wind up on people's shelves and get borrowed and lost, and they're in secondhand book sales, and, you know, they're thrown out on the street and people just find them. And I thought, you know, maybe why shouldn't I give a little help to a reader, an unknown reader down the road, by telling them right off the bat, like, that this person was worth their caring about. So there was an introduction I'd actually written for the British edition, which I then used for the paperback, the American paperback. And now that both Heather and Ruth say it, you know, I think probably some of that language was in the proposal. Writers are nothing if not economical. And if you said it well enough to convince a publisher, you probably figure you've said it well enough to convince a reader. But I also, you know, I guess I thought, so I think David Foster Wallace had an interestingly bifurcated existence, where in that every writer knew his name, but many, many ordinary common readers, use the Woolf phrase, you know, were afraid to attempt him. So I think I was in a slightly unusual position where you know, the biography could be the thing you could start with. It could be your entry route into David. And also because I live in a suburb, to be honest, like the amount of energy and enthusiasm around my biography was much lower than it was when I'd crossed the river and go into New York. And so I understood right off that there were people who had to be convinced, people who would never be convinced, people who, you know, had vaguely heard of his death, and so on. Anyway, so I kind of tried to have it both ways in the end.
So, Daniel, you say in your book that I think the phrase you use is that letters are the lifeblood of the biographer, and I'm sure that we've all had the experience that it's pretty incredible, not just letters to and from, but my very favorite thing, which is third-party correspondence, where you get to overhear the gossip about your subject. And so I'm just curious, first of all, how you went about sort of gathering, and then also how you went about choosing. All of you have these incredibly concise and like a greatly witty use of quotations in your books, and that comes from, you know, just the endless kinds of reading of letters to be able to pull out the real gems from a lot. So I was curious about that process for you, and whether there were any places where you wanted to but didn't include something maybe in the letters for some other reason, because most of you chose very short quotations as opposed to really like long chunks of letters, just in part to keep the story moving. So yeah, how did you go about doing that, and how did you work with the letters? Did you treat the letters the same as some of the interviews too?
Do we reverse the order now, or?
Yeah, let's. Daniel, go first.
Fresh and perky. Well, I mean, in my case, you know, again, there was no archive, so I was in a slightly different position from most biographers, in that I became the archive, you know, and so essentially a lot of what I did in terms of letters was, you know, I went to see people. And then I asked them for letters. I mean, I have a phrase that every great journalistic visit ends with a trip to the photocopy machine. Slightly archaic now, but I didn't use a lot of letters in the original New Yorker piece because I didn't have them. And I felt, and again, I think a lot of people feel differently, but when I looked at the quotations that I had from people, they felt thin against what letters were able to convey. In other words, like there's some, quotation is the lifeblood of journalism, but it's not necessarily the lifeblood of biography. And I often found, to my surprise maybe, that a lot of what people told me became kind of part of the texture of the biography. In other words, I kind of absorbed it and made it mine. Whereas letters, the letters would stay as letters. Now, one thing I think that that I felt very strongly was that, that there's three aspects to the writer. There's the private writer, there's the public writer, and then there's the letter writing writer, right? And so the letter writing writer, I never mistook David's letters for honesty, but they were still different from his public position, which we mostly knew. I mean, if you were paying attention and cared, you knew. And then his deepest, darkest, most private life. So I love that suddenly I had this whole other person effectively in my narrative, that and I didn't feel, so he did a million interviews, and I have to admit I barely even, like his radio interviews, I mean maybe I listened to them, maybe I didn't, because I just felt, look, writing, I think the single gift of writing about writers, the subject of our panel, is there's this match, right? I forget who said that written criticism about music is like dancing about architecture. Who's that hoary old cliche from? But it's still true. So we have the gift, the virtue, the benefit, all literary biographers do, that we're writing in the language they're writing in. And I just thought, well, use that. I mean, you've got that. You've got a guy who turned out somewhat anachronistically to write a ton of letters, very anachronistically, really. And he stops when email becomes more potent as a force. So I was just like, just use it. Like these are a whole, you've added a person to your biography.
Oh, Heather.
Sorry, I lost track of our order.
Sure.
I think Heather was gonna.
Yeah, I love to quote from letters. It's something that I even did, in my PhD. Like I guess I always wanted to tell stories, and quoting from letters was an important part of that. And I was even shying away from literary theory, like in graduate school. I was leaning more toward literary history at a time when theory was really ascendant. But yeah, I would always go back to letters and archives, and I just love archival research. I'm very happy, as probably Ruth and Daniel, you are too, just like sitting in an archive and trawling through a writer's files. It's like nothing is better. In terms of just choosing the quotes, I don't know that I have a method for it. I just feel like if I read something and I kind of have that aha moment, then my reader will too. So it's sort of, I try to pick and choose the lines that moved me and that I hope will move my reader as well. And as Daniel was saying, Plath wrote differently to different people, so you really have to be aware of who she's writing to. She writes less honestly to her mother than she does to her psychiatrist, obviously. And one of the things, I mean, if you're writing about a writer who has been called confessional, you always have to be aware of that. I was trying to show in my biography that the confessional label is a bit of a misnomer, and Plath actually treats biography and autobiography very ironically in a lot of her poems and fiction. So I I was almost like trying to get her to escape her biography through my biography and trying to highlight the separation between the work and the life, if that makes sense, because those things with Sylvia Plath are always kind of so tightly joined, and I understand why, and there are good reasons why they are. But so being aware of the different audiences for the letters and trying to kind of highlight her different, different approaches, different selves, that was another challenge. But yeah, I feel like letter writing for me is the bedrock of literary biography.
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. Daniel, I really love what you said about never mistaking what your subject says in letters with the truth. And of course, yeah, especially when you see somebody writing different versions of the same event to different people, it's very easy to become quite cynical or, quite sort of existentially despairing about whether it's ever possible to find out the true version of anything that ever happened. Which certainly was something I found myself going through. For Shirley Jackson, I had a somewhat different experience from both of you in that there was an archive, but it was quite incomplete. So there were Shirley Jackson's letters lived in Stanley Hyman, her husband's archive, which conveniently enough is also at the Library of Congress along with hers. But aside from those letters, there were not many of her, and also a large collection of letters that she wrote to her parents that are included in her own archive that were saved by her parents and preserved for her. And those letters mainly have to do with household and family type issues and not as much with professional or intellectual ones. And so I spent a lot of time searching out her letters. Pretty much any person who corresponded with her who had their own archive, I went and searched in that person's archive to see if anything from her would turn up. In some cases, significant things turned up, significant, mostly in terms of the information rather than the amount of material. I think for a literary figure, Shirley Jackson actually doesn't have that many letters of her own preserved aside from the family papers, which incidentally, a selection of her letters is about to be published for the first time. I think next month. It's an edition that I didn't actually have anything to do with. It was put together by her children. But it's a very exciting moment in Shirley Jackson's studies that those letters will be published. But a lot of times I turned up dead ends. The people she had corresponded with in almost all cases were long dead, and a lot of them had not been famous, and their descendants hadn't had any reason to preserve their letters. And I find that this is very often the case in writing women's biography, is that the archive simply does not get preserved. Or if it is preserved, it might be in a place one isn't expecting it, like under the name of the person's husband rather than their own, or in the sort of amorphous category of family papers, where I was fortunate to find some things. But unfortunately, in the end, I found it kind of a sad story, a tragedy in terms of how much of women's literary history has been lost. And I feel, fortunate that I was able to resuscitate some of it.
I was curious what you think about the idea that biography doesn't help us know a writer's work better, that the life doesn't help explain the work. I think that all of you have suggested that can't be the case, but there is a kind of argument that the mysteriousness of the work might better remain that, and that there's some speculation between the life and the art that is perhaps not worth linking. And I was just curious if you, in figuring out a way of talking about the life and contextualizing the life in relation to the work, and in the in the importance that the writing played in all of your biographies, if you ever felt that the life was doing a disservice, knowing more about the life was doing a disservice to the work.
I'll start. I never thought that. I always had a kind of unshakable sense that this was important work, that this was public scholarship, this was history, this was women's history. And again, being an academic, especially in English, I mean, I was trained not to look at the life, right? If we've come up in the 90s and early 2000s, I mean, that was a no-no, right? Biographical criticism, oh my God, don't look at the life. I mean, I think
you mean the biographical fallacy, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, new criticism was still sort of, it cast quite a shadow, and nothing wrong with new criticism. I love sort of teasing out the technique and the rhyme and all of that. And that's one thing that Plath was very good at. And I wanted to kind of highlight her technical brilliance. But no, I mean, I felt like recontextualizing her life into the time and the place, especially because she did have to fight so hard to achieve what she did. And there were so many kind of sexist barriers put up in her way. Yeah, no, I thought it was an important story to tell, and I still think so.
Ruth, do you want to add something?
Sure. I mean, I think the life can tell us something of meaning when interpreting a writer's works. Obviously, none of us would be here if we didn't believe that. I mean, that said, I think it is important not to get lost in either place, whether the life or the work. And it's easy to develop blind spots either way. And there's an anecdote that I'm thinking of actually about Henry James, regarding the Aspirin Papers, his novella coincidentally about a biographer, where my impression is, and I'm not a James scholar, so this may not be entirely accurate, but from the reading I've done about it, my understanding is that his inspiration for the Aspirin Papers is usually attributed to a note that he wrote in his own diary about hearing a story that resembled the story he tells in the Aspirin Papers about a biographer who becomes obsessed with a poet, that somebody had told to him about an aficionado of Percy Bysshe Shelley, who did something similar to what the character in the Aspirin Papers does in terms of actually moving in with the elderly woman associated with the poet who holds all of his letters. And that, James scholars had assumed that because he wrote in his diary that this was his source for the Aspirin Papers, that it was so. And then when I was doing some reading into it, I read an interesting paper by another scholar who argued that less so, or maybe as much so, than this story was James's own experiences as a biographer, writing his book about Nathaniel Hawthorne and the ways in which he found his own interest in Hawthorne to be sort of corrupting and to damaging to his psyche in a way that he wanted to portray, that he wound up portraying the corruption of the biographer in the Aspirin Papers. I thought this was fascinating that, James's interest in the subject actually went back deeper than he had acknowledged to himself, potentially, in this diary entry, where he thought that his model was one thing, and it turned out potentially that it could be something else as well. And I think, they're probably that can work as a cautionary tale for lots of us in terms of the way we read the things that go on in our subjects' lives, and what we attribute their inspiration to. I mean, for me, that's always, in the end, one of the most fundamental questions is what did inspire them? And, you know, it might, in fact, not be the thing that we think it is or the thing that they said it was, but something that could be deduced more organically if we were just looking at the text itself.
I mean, I think that it's the kind of question I think that probably biographers are not all that well equipped to answer, because if you put three novelists in these little picture frames, I think you'd probably get an absolutely opposite answer. And I think, I mean, I can only speak in the case of David Foster Wallace. It is actually an interesting question. I mean, I feel like Sylvia Plath, it almost can't be imagined because of the confessional nature of her writing, or Heather points out the ironically confessional nature. But anyway, the door is open. But I mean, Wallace did not really write very autobiographically. So you don't have that particular invitation in that you would have with many other writers. And so, you know, he sort of borrowed his kind of hauteur, his kind of his approach to these questions, I think, from DeLillo, who he was very indebted to in terms of how to be a novelist. And you don't actually always, despite what you might think, I don't think novelists learn how to be novelists from writing novels. I think they learn how to be novelists from other novelists, by which I mean the public persona or lack of persona of a novelist. And I think David very, very much learned from DeLillo the kind of somewhat standard idea of being invisible, letting the work speak for itself. And I, of course, had my own reason to be in there, you know, which we talked about a little bit. And I believe fundamentally, there's a moment, I was trying to find it on my phone. There's a moment in Roth's last book, Exit Ghost. Is that what it's called? Is that the title? Anyone? Sounds wrong. Anyone know? Exit Ghost? Is that the name of his last book?
That's the title, but it's not his last book. It's
Oh.
his last novel in the Zuckerman series.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks. Well, anyway, so there's a moment there which people, you know, doing unto Jim Atlas what he did unto others, have diagnosed as Roth actually talking about Atlas, in which the Jim Atlas character, and to Roth's credit, he gives him a pretty good line, says like, we're doing what you taught us to do. Like, we're taking appearance, we're looking underneath it, we're examining in a kind of light way the psychology of the person we're looking at, and we're creating drama out of a life. So how can you criticize us for doing exactly what you novelists are doing? So I mean, that's the counter argument. But I do wonder if we could imagine an admittedly imaginary world where it was illegal to write literary biography. I mean, it would put us out of work. But would we, you know, if we were really honest with ourselves, would we take more? I see Ruth has a beautiful bookshelf behind her. My eyes are not good enough anymore to know what the titles are, but, you know, let's imagine them as all novels. You know, would we love reading novels more? I mean, you know, we'd have free play to imagine the life that had created these things. I think it's an interesting, you know, it's an interesting question. I don't know that I have such a simple no to give to that. Although, I mean, obviously, I think that what I did, what Heather did, what Ruth did, what Karin did, you know, is exciting and is important and does provide tools for many readers to read books with greater instruction, you know, as Roth pointed out in his Atlas voice, you know, for greater, you know, for greater whatever. And then this is my last comment on this. I mean, I think all of us would say, well, I guess we'd all say with Freud that, like, when you really get to the mystery of creativity, like, we don't actually have anything to say. I mean, we don't really know why one person writes spectacularly about an almost similar or identical set of life events. Like, I don't think we pretend. I can't tell you why David Foster Wallace grew up to be a brilliant novelist. I mean, that's not what I mean, do you guys feel you did that in your books? Like, you explained the genius? Because I didn't even try.
Well,
A little bit.
I guess like the voice of skepticism with me wasn't so much like, about writing biography. It's on the relation, can biography illuminate the work? I mean, the devil's advocate in my mind was saying like, well, what's the point of reading this book when you could just go read all of Sylvia Plath's published letters and her journals? Why do you need a biography? Why can't you just read her work and her letters and her journals and make your own conclusions and come up with your own conclusions? So that was one of the challenges that I sort of set myself while I was writing, was to kind of justify and offer the reader an interpretation,
Yeah, I mean, you could go and read all of Sylvia Plath's letters and diaries and come up with your own interpretation. But I think, what the reason people are reading your biography, Heather, is to read your interpretation. That we all can create our own narrative of these people's lives. I mean, most readers are not obviously going to spend the time doing that. They need the shorthand version, as it were. I mean, I guess, I don't want to suggest that I'm under the delusion that I'm able to explain Shirley Jackson's genius any more than Daniel feels that he's able to explain David Foster Wallace's. But I guess what I wanted to do is to give a sense of how she was formed, how she formed herself in terms of what she was up against, almost like an oyster making a pearl, right? These are the things that challenged her and made her into the person she turned out to be, even, if the process of that happening was one that I, couldn't see and nobody would ever be able to.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, your answers, because Daniel, the parts of your book where you talk about how he's writing about his mother when she's just a few miles away, and I felt like that made me a better reader of him, and a more sensitive reader. I found it very moving, and so some of the aspects of including the life, I think, actually bring you back to the work, which is an exciting thing to have happen. So I know that we should take some questions from the audience, and so please feel free to put questions in. There are a couple already, so I will ask some of these. One question is that everyone on this panel has written about someone who is alive past the 50s. Have you thought about tackling writers further back in history where interviewing people who knew them is not possible? Yeah, I'm curious about this. I love interviewing so much. It's really one of my absolute favorite things to do, in part to hear a kind of, to get a kind of oral history of things in the moment, and to be able to still do that for people is pretty exciting. And it makes me read some of the letters differently and understand ways of thinking about some of the words that are used when I hear them spoken as well as read. So I'm curious what you all think of this. And I know, Ruth, you're now tackling a project that's further back in history.
Yeah, a little bit, although there actually still are a couple of people left to interview. I'm with you, Karen. I love interviewing. I think we all love the idea that we might be learning something that nobody else has ever heard before. And the only way to do that is through direct personal contact. So, I wouldn't say that that's not the reason that I've chosen my subjects. That didn't really factor into it. But I am, I guess, drawn to more present day figures for that reason.
And Daniel?
I had actually, before the Wallace, toyed with the idea of some earlier figures. And one book I thought about writing was about Brahms and Clara Schumann, for instance, which I thought was in some ways, as they say, very modern, and in some ways not. And I think one thing that stopped me was that and now it may have been as much a national thing as a chronological thing, but I just couldn't really figure out what these people were thinking. I mean, I never had that problem with Wallace and his cohort, which, he was actually my age. So in a sense, I had the easiest of the three assignments, if you call, or four assignments that we've all done here. I mean, so literally, if I wanted to know what David Foster Wallace was listening to, I only had to kind of, look at what I was listening to in 1970. I mean, the overlap wasn't 100%, but it was really big. And so, when I thought about like Schumann and Brahms and their relationship, like I just didn't know. I mean, I just thought I don't have enough. I can't be sure. I think as a biographer, maybe I just did it wrong. You make a certain number of guesses based on your knowledge of the culture in which the person is embedded, because you actually can't know everything. Obviously can't know everything. So what were the guesses I was going to make, about mid-19th century Central Europe, I just didn't feel, I felt like either I'd have to do a ton of reading, which I wouldn't have entirely trusted. I'm a person, again, from a journalistic background who, although, I mean, I agree with both Heather and Ruth about interviewing. If I can't have interviewing, I want spoken word. So for instance, there's a wonderful resource for people who want to do books about England, which is court cases, because court cases in England, they included a transcript, at least maybe it's partial, but anyway, you actually hear the voices of the kind of people who famously are left out of history, in this case, alleged criminals. So I would want something like that. I feel as a writer, I need to see people off stage to understand them. And maybe I just didn't feel I had that with Brahms and Schumann. I just didn't feel I had them off stage enough to understand what it meant when they were together.
Yeah, I haven't really toyed with the idea of writing about earlier writers. I wish that I wanted to, because it would make the permission situation a lot easier. But I don't know. I guess I'm too insecure. I like to stay in my little field of specialization, my post-war poetry area. I don't know that I feel confident enough to stray outside of that.
Do you know what your next subject is?
Yeah, I'm about 75 pages into a new book. It's about Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Adrienne Rich, and Maxine Kumin in Boston in the late 50s and early 60s, sort of right at the moment when confessionalism is born, and Robert Lowell is in the mix. And yeah, it's kind of a slice of life / group biography. I find it very freeing. I find the form wonderful. I could not do another Cradle to Grave next. I was just too exhausted after Plath. I do have someone in mind for another big biography, and I'm currently kind of discussing that idea with the estate. So we'll see where that goes. But yeah, I love that I don't have to track down every last detail about these writers, and then I can tell more, just a shorter story. And yeah, no, I'm really enjoying it.
Daniel, what about you?
Well, I mean, first of all, I agree with Heather that the incredible advantage of someone from longer ago is you're dealing with an archive and not an estate. I'm kind of like, I've always admired that there's a group of British biographers who turn out biographies, one after the other, and it seems like they barely stop for tea before, and they pop one, they kind of go around popping off members of a generation, and that's just not. I'm kind of like I'm kind of like a hybridy guy. Like I think that David was an unusual kind of moment for me, and that if someone else who so caught my imagination came along, sure, but that I'm more interested, and I'm being a little evasive just because I have a couple of projects going, and who knows which one will, I mean, by now they should already be in college, but unfortunately, let's say, who knows which one should come out of the cradle. So I want to be a little vague there, but I think I like the idea of doing something at least somewhat different, and taking the things I enjoyed most about biography and leaving behind maybe some of the things that were hardest. Like one thing I found hard about biography, which I haven't really talked about, is and it sounds like Ruth is escaping it for her next book, but I found the form really hard to defy. I felt like the life, I wrote a first book called The Family That Couldn't Sleep, and that book I invented almost entirely for what I wished to tell about. It was about a fatal disease, but it was about Italy, and it was about how we learn about disease, and it was about infection, and it was about the first cases of scrapie in sheep. I mean, I had a blast doing that book. I kind of want some of the fun back, like the vise of the life, to begin it's really hard not to begin at the beginning and end at the end. And even if you do a flashback to open it, still it's just really, really hard. Maybe somebody's done the equivalent of Martin Amos's Time's Arrow, where you tell the story from the end. Interesting idea, right? But I believe we'd all agree that biography is so damn hard to begin with that to sort of pedal the bicycle backward just sets an insuperable task. Like, you just don't want to add difficulty to access, thinking, estates, getting your facts right. Where was he or she on Tuesday in 1952? These are things that matter in biography. That's a lot of work before you even begin to try to make your biography special. So to do it backwards, almost seems like kind of an unkind trick to play against us. But that's the thing I feel most, many years out from the David Foster Wallace, is that I want to play a little bit more in the fields if I can.
Well, I think what you were mentioning before about the place where you yourself as the writer is part of the project, I think comes out in a lot of the biographies that are also anti-biography or resistant to the form in some way, like, out of sheer rage, or even some of the novelistic versions of biographies, like Penelope Fitzgerald's The Blue Flower, or Flaubert's Parrot, like those books that are playing with the cradle to grave aspect, and then resisting it, and still through that giving you a real sense of the writer's life and the writer's own relationship to that life at the same time, because I think it's difficult to do that in the.
I like that book. I can't remember the author's name. I'm sorry, but that Montaigne, How to Learn About Life, Montaigne in 12 chapters. But I thought that was rather well done. I forget who is the author. I'm sorry. Does anyone know of him?
Sarah
Bakewell.
Bakewell. Yeah.
I thought that was good.
And Ruth, is part of your choice of Anne Frank an aspect of this idea of thinking outside of the kind of subject that you were working with before?
Somewhat, I guess. Excuse me. I guess unlike Heather, I felt like I didn't actually want to return to the same time period. And I felt like many of the writers who were sort of available for biography, as it were, did come from that moment. I felt sort of done with the 50s and early 60s, at least for now. It felt too familiar, and I just sort of wanted to go somewhere else. But I will say, yeah, like Daniel, I entertained the idea of not writing biography at all. Because the process of dealing with estates can be so, challenging and frustrating, that I, longed to do something that I could have total control over myself.
So there are just a couple questions in the chat, and then
I'm sorry. Somebody wrote something interesting in the chat, which is that the new biography of Stephen Hawking is told in reverse chronology. So thanks to Amy Redding for that information.
Fascinating. I would love to see how that's done.
Oh, Morrison's Edison, right? Thank you. That's true too.
Morrison's Edison is. I have that. That's in reverse order. I don't think I realized that.
Okay, there's two more questions here that we haven't asked, and then we'll end this panel. As a Hollywood veteran, I'm very interested in film versions of your subjects. Ruth, did you have an official connection with the Elizabeth Moss film, and did any of you recognize your subject as a character on the screen?
The short answer is no, I didn't have any connection with that film, official or not official. I know that the film Shirley was sort of presented as a biopic, but it is a work of fiction from top to bottom.
She was reading your bio though, somewhere along the way, wasn't she?
Yes, she apparently did read my bio as inspiration for how to go about creating the role of Shirley. I would say that she, Elizabeth Moss created, I think, a version of Shirley Jackson that in some ways was very convincing, and then that character is put into a totally fictional setting. Among the fictionalizations of it is that she doesn't have any children. And in Jackson's life, her children were, simply crucial in who she became as a creative writer. So, for that reason alone, I think it can't really be taken seriously as a portrayal of Jackson as a writer.
Mm-hmm. And another person asks about the challenges of writing about writers whose suicides have inevitably overshadowed or shaped their legacy. How do you navigate that and prevent the reader's hindsight from dominating the book? And I think, Heather, this is something you took on immediately in your recontextualization of the subject, and Daniel also in the preface of the copy that I have, you also begin, even though you're beginning at the funeral, you also begin with a kind of sense of the humanity of the life that I think changes one's sense of what kind of book one is about to encounter, so that you feel like you're about to encounter the life, not the death. So, but I'm curious what you both will say about this.
Well, one thing that I still hear, and like even in book talks, and a lot of people will sort of challenge me and say, well, don't you think the only reason she's famous is because she committed suicide? And I actually don't think that that's true. I think I may have thought so 10 years ago, but now I think that her most important poetry collection, Ariel, would have had the impact it did, regardless of how she died. Because I look at someone like Adrienne Rich and the impact of diving into the wreck. I look at Robert Lowell and Life Studies, and those books, they just sort of changed post-war poetry. And I think Ariel would have had its moment as well. I don't think that the manner of her death determined the impact that her work had. On the other hand, I do understand that there is a public fascination there, especially when we consider, the spectacle of the woman falling apart. That is something that the media loves, especially. Witness all of the Britney Spears coverage years ago that was been in the press recently, and just how awful that was. And I think sort of Plath is almost like a posthumous victim of that. So I get it, but I don't actually buy that narrative, that her fame depends on the death, the manner of the death.
I think that Heather's right. I think also as the years go by, the manner of the death, at least in David's case, is less what people even know about. I feel maybe with Sylvia Plath, and I don't know enough about the history of and maybe it is a fascination with her, with a woman falling apart, as Heather says. But I think with Wallace, actually, I think that he has this book, Infinite Jest, that still lives in the culture in a sort of unusual way. And I think that's probably, I can imagine that for most people who would be sympathetic readers for him, in the youngest generation, there's still a kind of 17-year-old who takes Infinite Jest off to Tibet in his or her, backpack. I don't know that person is as focused on David's suicide as conceivably a person might be on Sylvia Plath. Again, I'm speculating, but in a funny way, I think it's kind of receded. It certainly was around when I began the assignment, and even in talking about, I just think there was something, honestly, about the way at least Sylvia Plath's suicide is depicted that is just beyond meaningful. And I don't think that's really true about David's death, which I think, at least I think of as I mean, I don't know there's a difference medically, but I think there's maybe somehow a difference narratively. And I don't know exactly how to put my finger on it. Another interesting thing just to sort of bring up for the future is I think the way people write about suicide is also changing in our culture. And I think that's something to keep an eye on as new books come out about writers who did die by suicide. I mean, one thing that's really interesting, I think, is, there used to be a phrase that was used, which now sounds really odd to us, which was the phrase, so-and-so successfully committed suicide after like X number of failed attempts. It's a very odd way to think about self-harm. And I think that's, for instance, the phrase successfully committed suicide is now gone, or it's policed in the language. I don't know, it's not gone, but, and I just think that's interesting because language, the policing of language always, to me, obviously enough, it sort of predicts or embodies policing of thought. So how are we going to think about these things differently? I think is a really interesting question, especially in the case of writers. The idea of kind of madness in writers goes back to the Greeks, probably before the Greeks. I don't know who came before the Greeks, but whoever they were, I'm sure they had the same idea. And so I think we're going to see a different way of handling these deaths going forward. I don't know what it'll be. I mean, I'm not putting any money down either way, but watch for it. I think it will become something writers have to work carefully around and maybe think a little harder about.
So, thank you all so much for being here and for talking today. And I hope that we get another chance to do this again, at least soon, if next year. And thanks to the audience for being here as well.
Thanks, Karin.
See you all later.
Thank you.
Thank you.